Welcome and greetings. I'm very delighted to welcome you to our Shuddhashar FreeVoice webinar. And as a note, this month, Shuddhashar also turns 33 years old. We have evolved many times, and we're delighted that this is now our second webinar. Our first webinar was in October. We focused then on some pressing questions about the Quran burnings in Sweden and Denmark, in particular Denmark's proposed legal ban against such events, as well as the national and international responses to those events. So I guess we don't like to delve into controversial topics. So today's topic is global war, the new world order and the politics of anti-war. This webinar is an extension of our most recent publication of issue 36, which is on war. That magazine issue includes 17 articles on topics including wars in specific places, such as Ukraine, Iraq, Yemen, Sri Lanka, Israel, and Palestine, as well as the rhetoric of war, right? The language of war, whether it's the war against higher education, the war against free speech, the war against LGBTQ, or the language of weaponization, especially the way in which that's being used, and all the language about war is being used by politicians, the media, social media. So as a note, and we wrote about this in the editorial as well, when we began planning this magazine issue earlier in 2023, we were certainly thinking about the Ukraine war, but we were also thinking a lot about the many wars that were still ongoing but had dropped off the news cycle, right? And then suddenly we have a new war that not new. It has been also ongoing, but the war and conflict in Israel and Palestine, and how that is now overshadowing so much of what we do and think about when we turn on the news or turn on our websites. So this webinar dives into the topic of global war with experts who specialize on war and on peace. And it's fitting that today also marks the anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to the US joining World War II. So I'm going to turn to introduce and welcome our panelists. But first, a note to our audience. Our panelists will discuss for approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. On your Facebook screen, you will see a box where you can submit questions at any time during this program. So feel free to submit your questions when you have them, and we will get to them toward the end. And now let me introduce our guests. Dr. Tarak Barkawi is Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University. He studies war and empire. He takes an interdisciplinary scholarship approach to reimagine relations between war, armed forces, and society in the modern world politics. He has written on the pivotal place of armed forces in globalization, imperialism, and modernization, and on the significance of war in social and political theory and in histories of empire. His most recent book is called Soldiers of Empire, Indian and British Armies in World War II, which was published in 2017. And it's a fascinating study that looks at the ways in which war soldiers were sort of reconceived as cosmopolitan rather than in national terms. And second, then, is Dr. Andrew Fiala, who's professor of philosophy and founding director of the Ethics Center at California State University, Fresno. He is an expert on ethics and political philosophy and is the author or editor of more than a dozen books and has published more than 50 scholarly articles and book chapters. And one of his most recent books is entitled Tyranny from Plato to Trump, Fools, Sycophants, and Citizens, which was just published last year. And he's also published on books about whether or not war can be justified. And he was editor of the Routledge Handbook of Pacifism and Nonviolence, and many more. Fiala is also past president of Concerned Philosophers for Peace, and he is an expert in the philosophy of peace, nonviolence, and pacifism, a strong advocate for civility. and freedom of thought. And then Iqtisad Ahmed is a valued member of our Shuddhashar FreeVoice's editorial team. He's a trained barrister and human rights lawyer turned published writer. His fiction and nonfiction and poetry deal with social, political issues for the marginalized and the oppressed. So with that as my introduction, I'm delighted to turn it over to our panelists and listen to what they have to say about our controversial topic today.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Tarak and Andrew, for joining us today and enlightening us with your presence and wisdom. I think the best place to start would be to build on what Lisa mentioned regards to Pearl Harbor being a pretext for a just war. I suppose the question should be, and it's a broad one, what, in your valued opinion, is a just war, or what constitutes war being just? And I think that would be a good place for us to start this conversation.
Tarak, you're muted.
I was just saying, go for it, Andrew.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And thank you for organizing this. This is, I mean, obviously an important topic, and unfortunately, it is not going away. You know, at one point people thought the world was becoming more peaceful. You know, there's a kind of wishful thinking. I think, you know, history shows us that there are just ongoing challenges of violence and war, but also hope. You know, so you know, one way of addressing that question about Pearl Harbor is to point out that after the Second World War, very quickly the United Nations formed, and this is also, I think, important to note. This is the 75th anniversary of the signing of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So that's part of the story, is that war happens, and then at some point we try to reconstitute a peaceful public sphere and a peaceful international system. Of course, it's not perfect, and there are failures across the board. Just what you asked Ikti about the justification of war in the Second World War. It turns out it's just very, very complicated. But I hate to say that all of this is so complicated, but I'm a philosopher, and we just make things more complicated. That's sort of our raison d'etre. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, that seems to be an obvious case of then a justified response by the United States that can then respond to aggression. So the just war tradition has an account of what's called jus ad bellum, which, just cause for war, that's responding to aggression. Seems pretty clear. Of course, I'll just throw this out. Maybe Tarak, you could fill in some of the details, but there was ongoing antagonism before 1941 between the United States and Japan, including the expansion of the U.S. empire across the Pacific. That's not irrelevant. Second point I'll make, and then I'll pass it on to my colleague. So you might have a just cause for war. I think that's kind of indisputable, that if you're attacked, then you can respond. But then there are questions of what's called jus in bello, which has to do with how a war is prosecuted and fought. And it seems pretty clear in retrospect that the American and Allied bombing campaign against Japan was a violation of principles of justice in war, including firebombing of cities and atomic bomb attacks against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which just, I'm laying that out there, that it just muddies the case. And I think we're seeing that also in contemporary, like literally before our eyes, that there could be a just cause for war, and then people, the war fighters, then go beyond the limits of what's appropriate within war. So I think that's very important to point out. That's my opening thoughts. Tarak, I invite you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Ikti. I guess I'd give you two. Let me say two examples and then draw a point from them. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii at the time of Pearl Harbor was not, in fact, a U.S. state. It was a colonized territory. And we forget in our memory of World War II we construct it as a conflict between nation states and between nationalisms, some of which were democratic, some of which were totalitarian. So Germany, Japan, Russia, Britain is the way that we tell that story. And we forget that, among other things, the Second World War was an inter-imperial conflict in which great powers were fighting over control of peripheries and who was going to create a world order after the two world wars of the 20th century. If you were in the Indian anti-colonial movement in the 1930s and early 1940s, World War II was a complicated thing. The British did not promise independence to India or even an increased status like the White Commonwealth during the war. In World War I, India had participated, expecting to get rewarded with a greater political status when the British Empire, but that proved not to be the case after World War I. So from the point of view of Indian anti-colonial people, it wasn't entirely clear what side you should take. And in fact, the Indian anti-colonial movement split with Bose siding with Japan and its supposed anti-imperial politics in Asia, and Gandhi leading a movement for Swaraj, and so on. So these are two situations in which the politics of World War II look a lot more complicated depending on from where you're looking at them. And so my first move is actually not to think about the justice of either a particular war or how that war is being fought, but to think in social and historical terms about what kind of war this is, and what it means to have an analysis of these wars, and then to try and locate myself politically in those conflicts. And I think war is something that pushes us to think in ethical and normative terms first, to take sides for this side in the war, against the war, this is really horrible, and not to reflect on the social and historical processes that are involved in the war, that are being produced by the war, that are being consumed by the war. And so that is the move that I would make to inform debate and inform our political thinking.
When we talk about taking sides, we often convolute that with having to side with one of the participants of war. Is there a way, perhaps, as you mentioned, Tarak, and I would also be very interested to hear what Andrew has to say regarding the pacifist tradition of, is there a way to shape anti-war itself as the side that you want to be on, rather than somehow expressing it, particularly in today's world of social media and people needing to be heard and expressing opinions, often quite fervently? Is there perhaps something to be said about the side to take can simply be anti-war, rather than confusing that for, I have to support one of the participants, the wronged one, and as we've been getting into regarding how you justify war, what a just war is, the causes are often complicated. There are people often on both sides who feel wronged and feel that there is just cause, or supporters at least. So I was wondering if we can look at it from an anti-war perspective, if that is a legitimate side to take, and perhaps for the majority of people globally, when we are discussing conflicts between two parties, that could be the ethical choice to make, where our side is the anti-war side, or pacifist side, if you will.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Anti-war, like, frankly, the whole idea is that war itself as an institution, and a structure, is something we should be critical of. So this tendency to pick sides, we've already narrowed ourselves down to within a whole context in which there are armed parties that resolve their differences through violence. From my perspective, the best kind of anti-war position is to say that the whole thing is stupid, frankly. Like, we could go very deep here, but violence doesn't solve any problem at the level of intellectual discourse, right? All violence does is it coerces, and it forces people to either submit or die or what have you. I mean, it's literally an animalistic level of interchange. One of my colleagues, one of my friends, Robert Holmes, wrote this book where he basically talks about the total war critique. I think this is the best idea, is that the anti-war position is opposed to the whole thing. Now, that being said, what do you do in the middle of a conflict? So there are probably going to be better or worse causes, but it turns out that it's all very, very complicated. And the minute we start picking sides, I think we lose track of that just larger global, sort of universal claim that war itself is just absurd. It doesn't resolve problems in the long run. It produces more problems probably than it solves. So I think that's the, one way to avoid the picking sides problem is to just step back and say the whole thing is dumb. I mean, I'm saying this very superficially. I could explain more, but it's a subhuman way to resolve conflicts. And I'll just throw this out there, and then I'll be quiet. But this presumes, of course, there's a better way to solve conflicts, and I think there is, and that is found in the nonviolent tradition, in the human rights tradition. I mean, the folks who are talking about the power of nonviolence, the Gandhi King kind of tradition, and other folks who are talking about human rights and so on. That the idea there is that we behave a bit better than our animal nature usually allows us to behave. So again, in this conversation, my point about this is that we don't want to lose track that there are alternatives to war, right? So there's one thing to be anti-war, be opposed to it. The next question is, well, what do you do next? And I think that has something to do with nonviolence and human rights and politics in a nonviolent vein.
Thank you, Andrew. I guess I would start with the observation that there are many human institutions and relations that are absurd and awful, and that doesn't mean that we've gotten rid of them or that we're going to get rid of them. I think it's interesting that you see war as animalistic, and I take the point that you're trying to make about that. But it's a very human thing, and humans have been doing it ever since they've had polities. And I don't mean this at all as an endorsement, but the use of force to repress people, to coerce people, to fight other people has been an ordinary and usual part of politics ever since we've had that word. That doesn't mean that we accept it or that we don't wish to transform it or change it. But it seems to me a very deep-rooted thing. Every human history we have has histories of war in it, histories of repression, histories of violence. So the stance of being against it as a kind of political and long-term sense, of course, makes sense. This is a horrible thing. It's a diabolical thing. But what do we do in the meantime? And I think one of the things about just how diabolical war is that it may well be necessary. And I think I have trouble finding a war in which this isn't true, in which you're fighting a lie in the name of a half-truth. And if that's the situation you're in, better to hang on to that half-truth. And maybe it's even a quarter truth that you have, and to choose the quarter truth may make more political sense than the half truth. I'm not a person who believes in nationalism. I think nationalism is a horrific doctrine, one that has spawned a lot of wars and that occludes our imagination of political possibilities. But all of that said, I'm with the Ukrainians. I would not want to be ruled by Putin's Russia. And if you make that statement, then you're in the war. And if you're in the war, then you better win it. And if you're going to win it, you're going to have to accept that everything that goes on in that war, all the bad stuff, is not just on one side. right? That's the quarter truth or the half truth. And that is a diabolical and disastrous position to be in. But I think it is one that human histories of war put us in regularly.
Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, no, yes. So I mean, you're exactly right that this is the human problem, is that we are imperfect, failed beings struggling in a world to make sense of things where things don't make sense. I think you're exactly right. I like to use the word tragedy to describe this, that, you know, we're in a tragic life. Of course, and I understand it, and I agree with you on the fact that there, you know, at some point we do have to pick a side, one way better or worse. Here's an attempt at an analogy, maybe I'll just push the conversation forward. You know, once you have cancer, you're going to have to either choose surgery or chemotherapy, right? But the challenge is cancer itself. Like, what do we do? How do we imagine? I like how you said that, imagining a different kind of politics. How do we imagine a world where there is no cancer, right? And so this involves all kinds of stuff outside of the specific battle, outside of the specific treatment. And I worry sometimes that, you know, we were seeing this in the conversation about Palestinians and Israelis and the war. People quickly pick sides, and next thing you know, it's polarization and it's antagonism, and it doesn't go anywhere. It just breeds more violence. At some point, we need to step back and say, you know, why does this cancer exist? What are the much larger human problems? And Tarak, I agree with you too. Like, these are not easily solved overnight. I'm actually not hopeful, you know, frankly, that we're going to solve any of this stuff in our lifetimes. But there is a bit of hope, and you know, in my piece, I pointed this out. There has been some progress. You know, slavery was abolished. The women's rights movement was successful. So we can make progress, even though it's a long journey.
I think these. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Andrew. But for purposes of the conversation, I think one of the ways that I would understand progress is that you know, it's one step forward, you know, 99% step back. If you look at Black Lives Matter in the US, you know, the reaction to it has been extraordinary. Now we're looking at potential dictatorship, the rise of white supremacy, the normalization of Trump in all kinds of ways, and that kind of reaction is also happening in Europe. It's happening in Britain. It's going on in Holland right now. So I think kind of progress narratives sometimes lead us away from just how fitful they are, and that things may go forward. You know, in the 40s and 50s, in the 40s, it was a good time for gay artists in America, but they took that back in the 50s, and it wasn't until the 70s that you get LGBTQ politics in a serious way advancing that program again. So things come and go. I think another thing that happens is that these horrible institutions transform themselves. You know, it's not clear to me that slavery as an institution is over in terms of coerced labor, modern forms of slavery, and so on. And of course, wage slavery. I would argue the reason that slavery was brought to an end, the Atlantic slavery, chattel slavery, of the kind that everyone sees as paradigmatic, has less to do with normative arguments, although those were important and activism was important, and a lot to do with the availability to the British Empire of cheap Indian labor that it could use to undermine the French dependence on slave labor. There is also capitalism, you know, needed slavery to get going, but capitalism had a different answer for the efficient exploitation of labor in different historical circumstances. So if we were, as it were, to end war, we might find that war reinvents itself as peacekeeping, as humanitarian intervention, as pacification, as any of the number as police actions, as people called the first war that was fought after World War II. Not the first war, but the first war fought by the international community in Korea under UN auspices. So there's a way in which these institutions, if we take a historical and social perspective on them, they transform themselves. And here we are back again on the diabolical grounds of the position that war and violence puts us in. Tragedy indeed. We both agree very much on that.
One of the interesting things that we're touching on, and I think it's fair to say, where war is ultimately about power. It is about asserting power and about dominating. And we've seen, going back to the Second World War, where it was a war of empires. It was wars between colonial powers. Gives way to imperialism, and one would say that throughout the remainder of the 20th and now the start of the 21st century, what we're seeing are wars for imperialism being fought to again exert power, exert dominance over other nations or other regions. One of the things you mentioned in your piece, Tarak, and if you can touch on that a little more. Is this what we're witnessing now is a multipolar world, as you talk about, and when you mention being on the side of the Ukrainians, for instance, and automatically the statement of I am with the Ukrainians opposing Putin's authoritarianism, means an endorsement of that war, taking a position on that war, whether we like it or not. I wonder if you could perhaps expand a little more on the multipolarity that we're seeing, and what that means for the institutions that Andrew mentions about the instruments of peace in the post Second World War world order. What are the challenges being faced by those, and really what are we're living through a moment now where, if we are to say we're witnessing a new world order emerge, or we're witnessing a new world order wishing to emerge, what does that mean for us regarding warfare and where we stand with it?
I guess I would start with Gandhi, who I think is interesting on these questions. Gandhi, in his first sort of phase of political thought empire was a good thing, was potentially a good thing. And it was a good thing because in an empire, everyone is a minority somewhere and a majority somewhere else. And the minority-majority politics of caste and religion and region in India and on the subcontinent could potentially be muted and resolved by situating them in an imperial context. He decided against that view when he got the measure of the British Empire during World War I, which he argued in favor of India's participation, only to see Britain clamp down afterwards. And I say that because he was amongst a number of anti-colonial thinkers who saw in empire a cosmopolitanism, an internationalism, a possibility for reparation for what had been taken from them during the worst parts of the colonial period, as well as a possibility to overcome their own sectarianisms, their own hierarchies in their own societies. So that we could talk sort of further about this, but I say this in preparation to say something that the younger Tarak would shoot me for, which is that I think part of the problem right now, and I think other people who are going to beat me up are my students right now, but is not too much American empire, but not enough American empire. Had a more robust American-centered world order in and through which the UN institutions, human rights, a kind of limited form of democracy were at least supported internationally. If we had a larger commitment to those things on the part of Western publics right now, we might not be facing a world in which Chinese and Russian authoritarianism, I think actually authoritarianism is too kind a word for it, in which I'm not in any way saying we need to have Iraq and Afghanistan occupied. Like Gandhi, I'm thinking about how is it that we might reform this international structure that we have, this UN world that was the product of the peacemakers after World War II. Yet many young people opposing U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war and what's going on in Gaza right now in the U.S.-Israeli alliance, they see the problem is all stemming from American empire. And I guess my question to them is what comes after? Because I would rather live in an American empire than a Russian or Chinese one right now. And in saying that, I feel that I'm back on the ground that I was laying out before of the dire political choices that we're in. And I'll shut up after making one more point. To begin to talk about things in this manner involves situating our analysis of war alongside an analysis of the historical development of world order and what are the political possibilities in that world order. And I see more possibility in the UN world that was set up after 1945 than I do in a world of multipolar competition between Russia, China, and what's left of the West. In a situation in which Western publics, instead of supporting that liberal internationalism, are turning back to the worst kind of politics possible. It would be a global disaster for the United States to turn into the kind of regime that the Republican Party is pushing for right now. I'll stop there.
Can I ask Tarak, just to go back to connect this to something you said earlier about nationalism. You said at one point a few minutes ago, you said, nationalism is really just a bad idea or a dangerous idea. What would be the function of nationalism in this new emerging cosmopolitan world order? Could you just expand that a little bit?
I mean, I don't have answers to this, but I think national liberation is an incredibly limited politics for the global South. I think the idea of everyone getting their own kind of ethnic state is not a world that I think is a very good world. I think the imperial dimensions of the post-1945 world was to create a world of small national states that could be penetrated by Western powers, informally or formally, by capitalism, by military advice and support and coups and so on. And many anti-colonial thinkers understood that getting a small national state controlled by a little client elite was not a good outcome from the world of colonialism and empire. I think this attachment of collective identities to a state with coercive power is a politics that continues to reappear. It's very popular. It really mobilizes people. And it is the condition for the use of force to protect the nation and the state, to fight internal enemies that dominates quite a number of the violent conflicts around the world. And as I look at Israel-Palestine, both sides getting their own state is not a solution to that conflict. What will happen is a rump Palestinian state that will continually be penetrated by Israeli power. I mean, the PA is, I think, an example of the kind of political possibility that leads you to. So I would wish that we start thinking about different forms of organizing our states and societies. What they would be, I don't know. How we mobilize a mass movement behind them, I don't know. I don't have answers to that. But I probably find myself more against nationalism than I do war in general right now. Yeah. I'm not happy or comfortable with the things that I'm saying, but they are the analysis that I have of the situation.
Can I throw something else on the table here, which is there's this so-called democratic peace theory, which basically says that if nation states were organized democratically as opposed to authoritarian or whatever, that there would be the spread of peace because democracies don't go to war against one another. So there's something about this that has to do with domestic politics and the domestic political arrangements. And then another theory that's kind of closely connected to that is what we might call a capitalist peace theory, which is, Steven Pinker has made this kind of argument that as markets interconnect us, right, because we're all sort of eventually in some global market, the real fractures are between the owners and the workers, or between, the inequalities economically. And then national difference and those national things kind of cut at a right angle to the interconnectedness of workers across the globe or what have you. And there could be an argument that, I don't really endorse this, but like corporations will solve some of this, right? So as Microsoft or whatever goes out across the world, it's in their interest for there to be peace and for markets to be able to go across borders. It's a different idea, but there's something about the democratic peace theory, the capitalist peace theory. Those are both alternatives to the old school, like 19th century Westphalian nationalism or something. I don't know if you have thoughts about those.
Sure. I guess Elon Musk didn't get that memo about corporations bringing peace. So, I am familiar with the democratic peace theory, and I've actually written on it. Key to the democratic peace theory is a very suspicious definition of war. And it's a definition of war that means that, for example, the U.S. covert operation to overthrow the elected government of Guatemala in 1954 doesn't count as a war, partly because it was fought through mercenaries and partly because there weren't 1,000 people killed in 1 year, even though there was a violent removal of a democratic government ordered by the United States executive branch. That's just one example. So the sort of very careful statistical manipulations that are required to get to that democratic peace finding of no two democratic states fighting an interstate war, I think are very suspicious. And they presume, anyway, we could talk about that further. I don't think that means that domestic democratic reform, and particularly reform of capitalism, might remove a lot of reasons for there being wars. And I think that one of the, I think that the general way of conceiving markets as solving war assumes people are rational. It assumes that the calendars of war and the passions of war are somehow resolvable by markets. That's not clear to me. The world was highly globalized and interconnected in capitalist terms before 1914. And that didn't save people from World War I. I think war operates on different kinds of social forces, identities, passions, things that are not, kind of in a market mentality. And when the war happens, the market is thrown out. Some of the best socialist regimes ever created are wartime socialist regimes and countries organizing to fight total war. So I'm sort of less hopeful about that. I think there's another kind of dimension. I don't think it's by the by. That the return of the possibility of global war happens as World War II is dropping out of living memory. Instead of learning, I think we have a generational problem. Each generation wants to try it out. Each generation is attracted to the passions of war, and to the passions of taking sides in wars, as we were talking about earlier about much of the protests in the U.S. against Israel. And that goes back to my fits and starts for progress argument that I think is a real problem. I think war is profoundly attractive to people. And I, as a scholar of it, I think that's crazy, but I understand why it is. The heights and the depths of human behavior are found in war, and it has a grip on the human imagination that I think is the source of why it is part of the source of this problem we're talking about, as much as it is about powerful interests favoring the use of violence. They couldn't do that if people didn't find violence in some way attractive and want to be part of it.
Yeah, can I just add to this important point that we also mythologize our own war fighting, right? So, the memory of the Second World War that we started the conversation with this, now the narrative is that the US was, no questions asked, the good guys, and that the war was a noble effort. Of course, like if you read Kurt Vonnegut or, people who lived through it, it's not so clear that it's a noble effort, and nor is it clear that it's salutary to participate in it because of trauma and moral injury and all this other thing. But I think there is an interest by national political agents to mythologize the past in that way, because that serves that purpose of bringing folks together in defense of the nation state. Which, Hegel said this, war is the health of nations, right? So that it's sort of like we establish our national identity by how closely we adhere to those myths of our past wars, and then, fight in future wars for similar reasons. It's a muddled mess from my perspective. And I think, one of the solutions to that is a little bit better critical thinking, better history, and also literature and the arts, right? Because again, like just Kurt Vonnegut popped in my head as an example, right? Artists who live through these things remind us it's not as great as we think it is.
I think that's such an important point you make, Andrew, particularly regarding mythologizing war, and the connection with history, where the way in which we teach history does put a greater than necessary importance on war and warfare, whether it's ancient history and emperors, kings, what they conquered, how much they conquered, how they conquered, becomes the more important aspects of history that we're taught, rather than what happened during the peacetime or how did they manage the state. We almost gloss over all of that in favor of who conquered how much, which feeds into something Tarak was mentioning regarding that need, or that thirst for war. People want it. People almost need it. Just wondering if we can go back to where we started, anti-war politics. Both of you touched on the protests going on in the US against Israel, particularly amongst younger people, and how do we go about encouraging anti-war politics and pacifism in a global sense, in opposition almost to nationalism? Because I do feel that nationalism gets in the way of building global movements for something like this, where I go back to, for instance, what happened in the US regarding the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War, something that my country benefited from in terms of shedding light on the genocide in then East Pakistan, now independent Bangladesh, a nation that the US was opposed to creating, but due to the existing anti-war movement, and despite the efforts of the American corridors of power, light was shed on what was going on. And then we go into how almost anti-war movements are discredited or marginalized. We now look back on the anti-war movement as, well, they were hippies, rather than looking at them as, well, what are the pacifist ideals that we can learn from and do now. And then I'll just throw one more example out there, where before the Iraq War, the UK saw the largest ever mass demonstration in opposition to the war. That was the largest number of people getting together, over 1 million, to demand that the government did not go to war in what they saw was not just cause. and yet the government did, and it does then leave the populace quite well disenfranchised. They feel like they haven't been heard. So where do we go? How do we go about building greater awareness of pacifism and building a global pacifist movement, or at least a pacifist conscience amongst ordinary people?
Yeah, if I can jump in on this, this is an obviously difficult question. I've been working on this for 25 years. I've been trying to give some credit to the word pacifism. And one of the kind of impetuses of this work is the fact that the very concept of being pacifist or anti-war is almost immediately dismissed by the mainstream media, by folks in government, even by folks in philosophy, in my discipline. This organization that I was a past president of, Concerned Philosophers for Peace, it's a small group because most of the philosophy world is really just not interested in this and dismiss the very idea. One of the solutions to this, I think, is to point out that smart, engaged people throughout history have often concluded that war is absurd. So in my essay that I contributed to the magazine, I quote Albert Einstein, among others, the idea that war is absurd is not a stupid idea. Now, it turns out it's not easy either, right? It requires a lot more argument, and it's not sufficient to put a bumper sticker on your car or go to a rally and wave a flag and say war is bad and then go home and do nothing. So it's much more difficult than just a slogan, right? Part of the difficulty is we also need to imagine, as we've been talking about earlier, how could we reconstitute the political world such that war is not the obvious solution to a lot of our problems? And that requires all kinds of very difficult conversations about nationalism, about national identity, about what we take to be the go-to way to solve problems internationally, and so on. And then just one other thing I'll point out about this is back to this myth problem. We're not self-critical. Right. So I'm saying we in terms of like members of nation state citizens, we just sort of take it for granted that we're the good guys fighting the good battle, and that, even like misunderstanding our own history in the United States. I talk with students sometimes about the Vietnam War. Our students don't remember, they weren't born, right? But they're surprised to learn that like the US lost the Vietnam War. They assume that America wins the wars it fights because of this myth that we've told ourselves about this. And I think that probably also is true across the board for nation states that mythologize themselves and their own history. So, I guess I would say, like, kind of a quick conclusion to my remarks here, we need to listen to pacifists, not just dismiss them. It would be nice if there was a media presence for folks who are critical of war. When war breaks out, you don't see anybody, the pacifists invited to the television shows. It's all the retired generals who get to speak on behalf of the military-industrial complex. We need to imagine alternatives, and then we need to be continually self-critical. And I think that's often we fail to do that.
It's funny. Sometimes I think the retired generals and retired veterans can be the best voices against the absurdity of war. It depends which ones you're talking to. I think I guess I would say a couple of things about this. I think one of the things that there really is an extraordinary movement going on U.S. campuses right now. People, it demonstrates again the power, for reasons I don't fully understand, of the Palestinian issue to grip the global imagination. And for people who know very little about it, who have no direct stake in it, to suddenly sort of identify with this struggle in some way, I think it's notable. I don't have an understanding of it. One thing I think is going on for young people who are being introduced to this conflict in a serious way for the first time, many of them, is that they're tracking Iraq and Afghanistan and the 20 years of failed imperial war that marks their childhood, and in fact, their entire time on this planet. And they understand those struggles as disastrous for their country and for the people who were bombed and occupied by the coalition forces. And I think they channel that when they look at Israel-Palestine. I think that's part of where it's coming from, at least in the United States. But then I think they make another move, which I find very, very troubling. I think Hamas has brought a catastrophe upon the Palestinians. I am not for Hamas, for the politics that they represent and for what they want. And if Hamas were rampaging through the suburbs that I lived in, I would expect there to be a very serious security response to that. And to see young left people and some older left people say things like that they're exhilarated by Hamas's victory on October 7th is to me to slip over into exactly the side taking that we're talking about, and to emphasize one side suffering, of which of course there's a lot more on the Palestinian side right now. I can understand why that people want to make that move, but it's exactly at this point that I think we need to intervene with new politics, of which pacifism is one. The kind of anti-nationalism I was talking about is another. But here we run into another problem, which is in the tweet era, people think that politics is about making a statement. You know, the students in our department have organized to demand that the department make a statement, as if that would do anything. As if we are, as a department, somehow an entity that can do something about Israel-Palestine. I think here I would like to see an older kind of anti-war politics, the provision of medical aid, witnessing, going, reporting back, putting one's body between the two sides, things that are more than having a banner or taking a side or demanding a statement be made. That kind of politics, a material anti-war politics, is not something that has a mass pull right now. It's going to the demonstration. I was at the demonstration in London. I marched, and I felt my voice was not heard. And a very interesting thing about Iraq, in both the United States and in the UK, politicians were informed that this would be a disaster. They were informed by academics. They were informed by senior soldiers who told them very clearly that this was not going to work in the way that they mattered. The idea of a Middle East population receiving the West as liberators in 2003, the absurdity of this, the idea that there wouldn't be an insurgency, yet it was done anyways. And it was done in ways that brought disaster upon the American empire, in ways that were directly irrational for American power in the world. That is the kind of beast we are fighting in war.
If I can interject with a brief point from the global south, one of the things that I feel is missing, well, two things that I feel are missing when we have these conversations about war, from an anti-war perspective. One is accountability. I feel like if the leaders who lead the world, empires, nations into war, to disastrous consequences, were held to account for their actions, for the deaths that they cause. Perhaps we could move towards, whether it is reparations as a starting point, certainly opening the dialogue regarding the merits of anti-war or being against war, and the other thing, which isn't helped by social media being attached to media as we know it, is the dehumanizing factor that we constantly dehumanize, and this ties in with nationalism and nationalist politics, where it is so easy to dehumanize people who are not us, and then they're just numbers which are being wiped away, as opposed to human lives. If we can perhaps increase awareness of the humanity of the people that are being affected by war, increase awareness of the price to the ordinary person that war has, including by the nations of the empires that are waging it. It comes at a huge cost to their own population.
Can I add just to this that, and Tarak, you said this also in terms of bearing witness. There at some point when there's tragedy and horror, the only thing you can do as a human being is just witness it. I mean, right there, the desire to judge immediately thereafter even clouds the bearing witness process, right? So there's something to be said for just bearing witness and solidarity with the victims on all sides. I mean, human suffering is human suffering, no matter where it occurs. And then I'll just throw in this also is worth bearing in mind. The soldiers themselves also suffer, right? So we're very focused right now on the Palestinian children and, the victims of the Hamas attacks, the horrifying Hamas attacks. But then we're going to ask soldiers to go in and do things on our behalf that are going to profoundly change their lives. They may die. They may be injured, and they will suffer trauma. And we know that this is the case with regard to those who fight wars on our behalf. And I think that's important to recognize. None of this happens in a sanitized way, right? It just profoundly impacts the psychological and emotional and spiritual lives of human beings.
I'm finding this conversation to be so fascinating. I've already learned a ton. I love the emphasis that you're making at this point about the humanizing aspect and the need to do that. And I know we only have like a couple minutes left, but I would love if there's any advice that you have for the younger generation who are now, like you said, Tarak, going out and trying to protest in various ways this war. But you also said, you made the comment that each generation seems to want to try out war, right? So maybe we could just end with some thoughts and advice for the younger generation who are trying to navigate this and are, rightfully outraged, but also maybe don't all have the history and the experience to make sense of the implications.
Don't tweet. That's
brilliant. Yes, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously true. I think it's important to just remember how complicated all of this is, that there are no simple solutions to centuries-long historical battles. I mean, where we started with the Second World War, I mean, that's the conclusion of the First World War, in a sense, right? And the First World War is the conclusion of preceding nationalist conflicts. There's nothing simple in all of this, and moral judgment is very difficult in this complex world and in the historical world that we're thrown into. So I think just slow down and think.
in line with the slow down and think, I guess if I see one like very large zone of a gap of understanding between especially, and I'm sorry for the audience, I'm talking about elite students in the United States, but they have no grasp or understanding of combatants, of soldiers. And I would like to see more graduates of elite US institutions go into the military, or engage with the military, or engage with veterans and have some understanding of this institution. Because I think one of the ways that the anti-war movement in practice works is to vilify militaries as the source of war. If we didn't have an army, we wouldn't have a war. And I think that's a mistake. I think the soldier is a human vocation, a human character that we need to take seriously, and we need to understand and engage with. And if we're to move beyond a world of war, they're going to be part of that. And I think sort of understanding what they know about what force does, what violence is about, I think would advance the understanding of anti-war people about what this thing war is. I guess that's what I'd finish with.
That's great. So don't tweet. Join the military, and but also learn much more about the history behind all of these conflicts. What I take from a lot of this is that humanizing need, and the need to put ourselves into the positions of other people to see the complexities from those various perspectives. So I thank you both for this really enriching and informative conversation, and Ikti for your guidance throughout this as well, your input as well. I thank you for joining us, and the audience, the same thing. I'm glad to have had this chance to share our esteemed colleagues in this platform. And if you have not yet read their articles, please do so on the website Shuddhashar. And I hope to see you again at the next webinar. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Ikti. And very, very nice to chat with you, Andrew. I enjoyed
Yes.
that very much.
I did too. Thank you very much.
Goodbye,
you.
everyone.